Darkness has a way of hiding things we'd rather not see, things that lurk just beyond the edge of our vision, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. Tonight, I have 3 real stories that prove sometimes the scariest things aren't from our imagination. They're right in front of us, maybe in your own home, maybe just outside your window, or maybe they're watching you right now. The first story comes from a woman who thought she was alone in her apartment until small, unexplainable things started happening. A door slightly ajar when she was sure she closed it, a faint sound of breathing when the TV was off. She blamed it on stress, exhaustion, anything to convince herself there was no real danger. But then late one night, she woke up to the feeling of someone standing over her bed. When she finally turned on the light, what she saw changed her life forever. Our second story follows a man who took a wrong turn on a road trip and ended up in a place that shouldn't exist. A town with no name, no people, just abandoned buildings and a strange silence that made his skin crawl. His car suddenly died, his phone lost service, and the road he came from was gone. And then he saw something moving in the shadows, something that knew he was there, something that didn't want him to leave. And finally, the last story is about a babysitter who answered a late-night call from the parents she was working for, except the parents were already home, fast asleep in their bedroom. The voice on the phone was warm, familiar, and it knew her name. It knew what she was wearing, where she was sitting, even the small cut on her hand from earlier that night. As she stood frozen, the line went dead. And then someone knocked on the window. These are real stories from real people, reminders that sometimes the unknown isn't just a story, it's a reality. So before we begin, check your surroundings, lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't ignore that feeling that someone might be watching. Because tonight, you'll learn that fear isn't just in your head, it's real, and sometimes it's closer than you think. The first story begins with Sarah, a 27-year-old graphic designer living alone in a small apartment. She had always loved her space, quiet, cozy, and just enough for one person. But lately, something felt off. It started with little things she could brush off as forgetfulness. A kitchen cabinet left open when she swore she closed it. Her phone moved from the nightstand to the couch overnight. A slight shift in the air, like someone had just walked past her, even when she was alone. At first, she ignored it. She had deadlines, long work hours, and too much on her mind to worry about silly coincidences. But one night, as she lay in bed scrolling through her phone, she heard it. Breathing. Not her own. Slow, steady, and just faint enough to make her doubt herself. She turned the TV volume down, holding her breath to listen. Nothing. Maybe it was the neighbors. Maybe she was imagining things. She forced herself to sleep, convincing herself she was just paranoid. Days passed, and the strange occurrences continued. Her bedroom door, which she always left open, was shut when she woke up. A faint smell of something unfamiliar in the air, like someone else's cologne. But the moment that truly made her stomach drop was when she found a single dirty footprint near her bed. Just one, and it wasn't hers. In the second story, we meet Daniel, a 35-year-old photographer who loved taking road trips to find hidden landscapes. He had a habit of taking back roads, following his curiosity rather than GPS. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he found himself on a road he didn't recognize. No street signs, no cars, just an endless stretch of cracked pavement leading toward a town that seemed frozen in time. The buildings were old, windows boarded up, stores with faded signs that looked untouched for years. Yet, something about the place didn't feel abandoned. The air was heavy, charged, like it was waiting for something to happen. He parked his car and stepped out, camera in hand. That's when he noticed the street was too quiet. No wind, no insects, just silence. Then, in the reflection of a dusty store window, he saw movement behind him. In the third story, Emily, a 19-year-old college student, took a babysitting job for a family she had worked with before. The kids were asleep upstairs, the house was dimly lit, and she was curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone when the call came in. The father's name popped up on the screen. Confused, she answered. "Hey, everything okay?" she asked. A slight pause, then a warm, familiar voice. "Emily, are the kids asleep?" Her stomach tightened. She had just checked on them 10 minutes ago. "Yeah, they're fine." Another pause. Then the voice said, "Good. You should check the front door. It's unlocked." Her breath caught. She glanced toward the door, her pulse quickening. She hadn't unlocked it. She was sure of it. Slowly, she stood, every nerve in her body on edge. "Wait, where are you calling from?" Silence. Then the line went dead. And at that exact moment, a soft knock echoed from the window behind her. Sarah stood frozen in her bedroom, staring at the single footprint near her bed. Her mind raced through explanations. Maybe she had stepped in something without realizing it. Maybe it was old, a mark from before she last cleaned. But deep down, she knew neither of those made sense. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. She turned on every light in her apartment, checking every corner, every closet. Nothing. No sign of anyone. She barely slept that night, every creak of the walls making her heart pound. The next day, she installed a security camera in her living room, telling herself it was just for peace of mind. That night, she fell asleep watching TV, exhaustion finally winning over her fear. But when she checked the footage the next morning, her stomach dropped. Around 3 a.m., while she was asleep on the couch, her bedroom door slowly swung open on its own. Or at least, that's what she wanted to believe. Daniel, miles away in that eerie, deserted town, felt his chest tighten as he turned around to face whatever had moved behind him. But when he looked, the street was empty. No footprints, no sign of life. He took a deep breath, shaking off the unease, and lifted his camera to take a shot of the street. As he adjusted the focus, something shifted in the viewfinder. A figure. A shadowy shape standing at the far end of the street, just at the edge of his lens range. He lowered the camera and squinted, but nothing was there. Lifting the camera again, there it was, same spot, not moving, just watching. His pulse pounded in his ears. He turned, ready to bolt to his car, but his feet stopped when he saw something worse. His car, which had been parked just a few feet away, was gone. The roadway he came from was gone. In its place was nothing but darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. Emily stood by the couch, her phone still in her hand, staring at the window where the knock had come from. The curtains were drawn, hiding whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. The house was silent, except for the distant hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Slowly, she stepped forward, every muscle in her body tense. The knock came again. Her breathing was shallow as she reached for her phone, her fingers shaking as she typed out a message to the parents upstairs. But before she could hit send, her screen lit up with another call. Same number, the father's name. Heart hammering, she answered with a whisper. "Hello." The voice on the other end was calm, steady. "Emily, don't turn around." Her entire body locked up. The voice sounded exactly like the father's, but something was off. Like the tone was just a little too careful, too measured. Her fingers gripped the phone tighter as she forced herself to swallow. "Where are you?" she whispered. Silence, and then the call disconnected. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Sarah's fingers hovered over her phone as she replayed the security footage again, her stomach twisting into knots. The door didn't just swing open. It moved in slow, deliberate increments, pausing for long moments, as if something was standing in the doorway watching. She fast-forwarded through the rest of the night, her breath catching when she saw something else. A faint movement, barely visible in the dim light, a shadow shifting in the hallway. It wasn't clear, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down her spine. She bolted out of her apartment, not caring that it was still early morning. She needed fresh air, space, proof that she wasn't losing her mind. But as she reached the stairwell, she hesitated. The air felt thick again, like she had just walked into a room full of people, except no one was there. A noise behind her made her spin around, a whisper, soft and unintelligible. She clutched her phone, heart racing. And then, for the first time, she realized something chilling. The security camera had only covered her living room. It hadn't recorded the hallway. It hadn't shown where the shadow had gone. Daniel clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe as he turned in circles, trying to make sense of what had happened. The town was the same, frozen, empty, but the road was gone. His car was gone. Panic clawed at his chest. He pulled out his phone, but as he expected, there was no signal. The shadow in his camera lens hadn't appeared again, but that didn't make him feel any safer. He needed to move. Standing still felt like an invitation for whatever was out there. He started walking, following the stretch of buildings, looking for any sign of life. A flickering light caught his attention. A small convenience store with a neon open sign barely glowing in the dark. It was the only thing in the town that seemed active. Against every instinct telling him to turn back, he pushed the door open. A bell chimed, but the store was empty. Shelves were stocked. The air smelled stale but not abandoned. Then, the worst part, music, playing faintly from an old radio behind the counter. Someone had been here. Someone might still be here. He took a cautious step forward, his breath coming faster. Behind him, the door clicked shut. Emily's hands trembled as she stepped away from the couch, her eyes darting between the window and the hallway behind her. She tried to keep her breathing quiet, straining to hear any movement upstairs. The parents hadn't responded to her text. Had they even gotten it? Were they still asleep, or... A floorboard creaked again, this time closer. She turned toward the stairs, phone clutched in her hand, debating whether to run up and wake them, but something stopped her. A shadow moved at the top of the staircase, not fast, not hiding, just standing, watching. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she stared up, unable to move. Then the softest sound, another knock. But this time, it wasn't at the window. It was right behind her. Sarah's breath came in short, shaky gasps as she stood in the stairwell, her back pressed against the cold wall. She forced herself to think, to make sense of what was happening. Maybe she had imagined the whisper. Maybe she was just sleep-deprived. But the more she tried to convince herself, the more that gnawing feeling in her gut grew. Something was wrong. She turned, ready to go back inside and grab her keys, but as she reached for the doorknob, she froze. The door was already open. Her stomach twisted. She had slammed it shut on her way out. She was sure of it. The hallway light flickered slightly, casting odd shadows along the walls. Slowly, she stepped inside. Everything looked the same, but it felt different, like the air itself had shifted. Then her eyes landed on the security camera, still blinking red. With shaky hands, she opened the app on her phone and scrolled back to the footage from the last few minutes. Her heart nearly stopped. The door had opened, but she hadn't been the one to do it. Daniel stood frozen in the convenience store, his pulse thudding in his ears. The door had locked behind him. He rushed back, yanking at a handle, but it wouldn't budge. The music from the radio crackled slightly, the static growing louder. Then he heard it. A shuffle from the back of the store. His entire body tensed. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the dim aisles, the rows of forgotten snacks and dust-covered shelves. Someone was there. He wasn't alone. "Hello." His voice sounded weak, unsteady. No response. Then, another sound. A faint tapping, rhythmic, deliberate. It was coming from the Sarah's fingers trembled as she rewound the footage, watching in horror as the door to her apartment creaked open by itself. But it wasn't just that. There was something else, something barely visible in the dim light. A shape, shifting just beyond the doorway, lingering for several seconds before slipping inside. Her chest tightened as she realized what that meant. Someone had been in her apartment. Someone was still inside. A cold sweat broke out on her skin as she backed toward the door, But before she could take another step, a soft creak echoed from the hallway leading to her bedroom. She whipped around, her heart hammering. And then, movement. A shadow emerged from the darkness, stepping into the dim light of the living room. Sarah's breath hitched as she took in the figure. It wasn't a stranger. It was her. Or at least, it looked like her. The woman standing in the hallway was identical to Sarah in every way. Same height, same hair, even the same clothes she was wearing now. But there was something wrong. Her face was blank, her eyes too. Sarah's chest tightened as she stared at the figure standing in the hallway. It was her, but it wasn't. The reflection of herself didn't move the way it should. It was just slightly off, just enough to make her stomach churn. The smile remained frozen, too wide, too unnatural. She wanted to run, but her body refused to move. The figure took a slow step forward, then another, and in that moment, something inside Sarah finally snapped. She turned and bolted for the door, yanking it open so hard it slammed against the wall. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could hear it, footsteps rushing behind her, matching her pace. Sarah ran out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the cold night air, gasping as she reached the street. She spun around, expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, but nothing. The apartment was still, silent. The door was closed. Heart pounding, she pulled out her phone and called the police. By the time they arrived, she refused to go back inside. When they searched the apartment, they found nothing unusual, no signs of a break-in, no hidden intruder. But when Sarah checked her security footage one last time, her stomach dropped. The last recording showed her running out of the apartment in a panic, alone. There was no figure behind her, no double, just her. Daniel moved cautiously toward the back of the store, his breath shallow. The tapping had stopped. The store was deathly silent, the flickering light above barely illuminating the aisle ahead. He gripped his camera tightly, heart pounding as he reached a last shelf. And then he saw it. A mirror. A large old mirror, covered in dust. But it wasn't his reflection staring back. It was the shadowed figure from before. It didn't move like him. It didn't blink when he did. It only smiled. And as Daniel took a step back, the figure stepped forward, except it wasn't in the mirror anymore. Emily's hands shook as she dialed 911, her eyes locked on the shadow at the top of the stairs. The knocking behind her had stopped, but she knew better than to turn around. A soft whisper drifted down the stairs, almost playful. Emily, it called in her own voice. The line connected, but before she could speak, the shadow moved. Fast. The call cut out, the lights flickered, and then darkness. 3 people, 3 different places, but the fear was the same. And maybe that's the scariest part. Sometimes, the thing we fear most isn't a stranger. It isn't outside. It isn't hiding in the shadows. Sometimes it's us.